So I should start out this section with a warning, and it's not it's not a warning about we don't do active scanning in OT environments, and it's not a warning about how there's little budget for most OT environments to do anything for cybersecurity. Just a warning that asset registers are probably the least welcome topic for people to learn about. And which is a shame because it's one of, if not really the most important aspects of OT cybersecurity. So it's one of, again, probably the most important aspect because so much of what we do in OT cybersecurity is based off of that asset register. And yet nobody wants to hear about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Out of my LinkedIn and my YouTube communities, it's whenever I talk about asset registers, it's always the least I guess the worst performing content by far. So I just thought I would throw that in. But again, I want to also stress that while it's one of those things that sure it's boring, it's not sexy to talk about, but it is critically important. And that is hopefully you'll understand after this section. Now, when we talk about asset registers, I remember hearing the term for the first time, and I was like, it kind of sounds like an asset inventory. And I was right. Right? Asset register is just the way in the OT world we say asset inventory. Right? So it's just an inventory, a list or a database, perhaps, somewhere, right? That you have a list of all your hardware and software and firmware that's installed in the environment. Right? That's what it should be. So it should have a list of everything in the environment, right? All of your OT assets like PLCs and HMIs. And then also, we have a lot of those types of systems that we brought over from IT, like workstations and laptops and tablets and servers, right? Those should all be on the lists as well. And then we do see a lot of virtualized systems now in OT, so we need to make sure we include those. And if I have a VMware server, then I have those 10 hosts running on top of it, all inventory, right? They should all appear as individual hosts in the asset register. So it's about having that list of not only just those individual assets, but properties about those assets like IP addresses and MAC addresses. So think if I'm doing analysis of network event, or maybe I get a intrusion detection alert, which we don't see that often in OT environments because most OT environments aren't doing monitoring. But let's say we are doing monitoring and we get an alert and I see an IP address of where it's coming from and an IP address of where it's going to. I need to be able to understand really quickly, well, what's at those IP addresses? So there is this idea of we can't protect what we don't know we have. People used to say that in IT, and I said that's not true. Especially with network security monitoring, I can watch over everything and I can let you know if there's something on the network that shouldn't be there. And in some ways, the same is true about OT. But again, the vast majority of environments don't do network security monitoring because they'll never have the budget to be able to do it. Think minimum kind of, to get into that world is, let's say, $100,000 US. Right? Most environments in the US don't have those resources. So then start looking at other environments around the world. They're not going to have those resources. So we have to start with the asset register and understanding what's in the environment and having as much context, right, into each of those rows in that spreadsheet that we have, right? Because they're almost always in Excel. We want to keep it as much as up to date as humanly possible. It will definitely drift over time. There will be inaccuracies, but if you do your best to keep it as up to date as possible, you're going to be way ahead of 95+% of the environment out there. especially when you think of things like, vulnerability management. We want to understand the make, the model of those systems, as well as the firmware version. So we can look up to see, hey, are there any known vulnerabilities in this particular asset running this one specific version of firmware? Now, here's a very simple example of what a asset register might look like. Right? You see we have a row ID, we have an asset name. So they should be named something, right? Some format that gives us an idea of what's going on in the environment. If you have, like you work across multiple factories, right? You might start each name with, an abbreviation for that factory. Or I was just working with an environment. They have a bunch of cruise ships and ferries, right? So every inventory name started with initials for the name of that ship or that vessel. You can see the type of asset that's listed. You could see the manufacturer, right? Now we can see the model again. So we can look at the make and the model along with that firmware, 2 columns down, to find vulnerabilities that are known to be on these systems. So once we have those vulnerabilities, then our vulnerability management processes can kick off. That's for a future module. For now, right, we want to just focus on making sure we get the data about the assets we have in the environment on the OT network, right? We get it all in the asset register. And we can have other pieces of information you see, like locations. I want to see IP addresses, MAC addresses. You can see in this one, we have things like installation date, last maintenance date, which does become important. We'll get into that, especially when we talk about things like intrusion detection and response. Status. And there's a lot more that we can look at. We're actually going to look at a sample asset register, similar to one that I would use with my clients. And you'll actually have that for download in the course files. So it should be attached to this section under the video. Now, unfortunately, when you go into most OT environments, if they have an asset register, this is what it looks like, right? It's like playing Sudoku. Some environments don't have any at all. And in some respects, I almost prefer that because it's nice having kind of that blank slate, right, to start over with versus what do I do with this? If I have a spreadsheet that has, oh, we know there's a PLC over here and it does something, or we know there's something over at this IP address, but we don't know what it is, or there's something with this MAC address in the environment, but we have no clue as to what it is. It's like, what do we do with that? Right? I'd almost just start over from scratch. But right, like with playing Sudoku, we can start with what's there and then we can fill in the blanks. Right? And that's really what a lot of asset management is about. Right? So we're going to talk about in this section, how do we build that asset register if you go into an environment that they don't have one? Or it looks like this where they have a few pieces of information, but it's definitely far from being a complete picture of what's in the OT network. And it really stuck with me. I think this was a conversation, or maybe even a podcast that I was listening to with Leslie Carhart years ago. And if you're not familiar, Leslie is that lead incident response. And if you're not familiar with Leslie, I was thinking of them as the lead of incident response for Dragos. Right? If you're not familiar with Dragos is one of the larger OT ICS cybersecurity companies, especially focusing around incident response in OT. That's their sole focus in being in the OT world. And they offer other services like pen testing and, of course, network security monitoring, which is their big platform. But one of the big things that they're known for is incident response. And so typically environments that want to bring in somebody from the outside, they're going to call Dragos or they're going to call Mandiant. Now, Mandiant also does a lot of IT incident response work, but they also have a really strong team led by Chris Sistrong that focuses on just the OT side of incident response. But anyways, Leslie had mentioned about, when they get called in, think if you run a plant and you have a cybersecurity incident and you call in a Dragos or a Mandiant or whoever you're calling, and they come on site, one of the first things they're going to ask you for is a copy of your asset register so they can quickly understand what types of systems and other assets are in the environment. If you don't have that asset register and you're having an incident, or even maybe you just think you're having an incident, and you bring somebody in and they ask for that asset register, and if you don't have it, or it's the Sudoku puzzle where it has a bunch of holes in it, right? There's no way they're going to get caught up to speed super fast or as quickly as possible. It's going to extend, right, the time it takes for them even just to get up and running. So we're talking about hours, if not like the potential, right? That just the impact is exponential. So then you start talking about potentially days, or some incidents now, right? We see go for weeks, or they're extending into months. And some of that is because they don't have a complete asset register and they don't have anything at all, or they have a Sudoku puzzle that's waiting for you to come solve it. When really you're supposed to be finding out what the attacker's been doing in the environment and how they got in the first place. So I've created an asset register based off of some of my previous work, but you can also create a very effective one. You might even think it has too much detail by just using any of the Gen AI platforms that are out there. For this type of work, I use Claude mostly these days. And here's a prompt that you can use, right? And I'll put this in the notes so it's there if you want to go ahead and use this. And you can put it in any of the others, and it'll do just as fine as of a job, I'm sure. We can just see act as a world leading expert in OT ICS cybersecurity who performs practical assessments and building asset registers. Because we have to tell the platform, right, who to actually be when writing, right, when creating this type of content. If you don't, you'll still get an okay asset register. It just won't be as good. It won't be as effective. Right? So we're going to tell it who it is, and then we say create an asset register template that would be practical and effective from a cybersecurity perspective. Right? I'm always looking for practical and effective. I guess we should have also. So one thing you can do to create your own asset register if you don't have anything to start with, or maybe you want to improve what you have, you can use any of the Gen AI platforms. Like I use Claude, you can see here for most everything these days, or use ChatGPT or Gemini or any of the others to go ahead and say, okay, act as a world leading expert in OT ICS cybersecurity who performs practical assessments and building asset registers, right? We have to tell AI in the context of, who are you writing this as? If you don't, it'll still do an okay job. It just won't be as good. It won't be as effective. But you try it with and without, and you'll definitely notice and feel a difference. And then we can say, okay, create an asset register template that would be practical and effective from a cybersecurity and operations perspective. Our operations needs the asset register more than we do in cybersecurity. This is why I'm always surprised why asset registers aren't more complete. Because if I was in operations, I would want that information at my fingertips and not have to try to figure things out, or you wait for Bob or Pierre or Jennifer to, who's worked in that plan for 20 years to answer a question. So we're going to use this prompt to go ahead and create an asset register, which is going to be just as effective as anything you pay for. You can see it even knows, hey, we're going to put it in an Excel spreadsheet because every asset register is in an Excel spreadsheet, or at least starts there. But I've, again, worked in some of the world's largest environments, up to $50 billion US, and still see asset registers in Excel. So here's the asset register that Claude comes up with it for us. You see, gives us a lot of detail on how to use it. And while this might consider too much detail, I even go into some customers, even medium, large size environments that are like, you know what, we just need to start off really simple. And I understand that, right? Let's just start with the minimum and build from there. So you might actually look at paring this down. But I also wanted to make sure that we looked at what a complete asset register, could include. The data dictionary explains how we fill out the asset register. And it's going to essentially explain everything we see in the asset register. So if you have questions about what's there, or somebody says, I don't know what this means, you're like, oh, just look at the data dictionary tab. Now there's the asset register itself, right? This is where it makes its money. And you can say, see, there's a lot of columns. Again, this is going to be very overwhelming for most OT environments. So I would pare it down to what you need from an operations perspective and a security perspective. And we'll talk about a few of those main items. Let me see, asset ID, right? Just like we were talking about. If there's a particular, location, right, and descriptor. And then we can look at, well, again, what type of asset. They even have a entire, right, built in where you can search and you can create your own drop down. So, maybe it's a historian, right? Or HMI or HMI operator workstation or an engineering workstation, right? All the things that we've been talking about. What it actually controls, right? What's its job in the environment, right? What does it monitor and control? Then we get into make, model, right? Serial number, firmware version. For me, those are the basic requirements. Anything on top of that is gravy, but especially from a cybersecurity perspective, we want to make sure that we at least understand the assets, right? The make, the model, and then the firmware version. Of course, we also want location or logical location, like network information, right? IP address and MAC address. But I want to find vulnerabilities in the environment. That's the manufacturer, right? The make, the model, and the firmware version. You can see, right? The list goes on and on, right? For that PLC, we don't have a operating system version or application installed on it, so we just say NA. Right? And then you can see it gets into the other pieces of information. Now, a lot of this is for operations, right? Where it's located, who owns it. But that's also great information to have from a security perspective, right? If we have an issue with, let's say, that PLC, who are we going to call on the operations team? Who are we going to call from engineering that can help us understand what is actually happening? Right, we can see networking information, and we see more than just, oh yeah, there's an IP address, and okay, there's a host name, and there's a MAC address. We can see the associated subnet, right, in VLAN. But it also documents, hey, what protocols are in use. So we see Ethernet SIP, so it could be a Rockwell PLC. We see, it's running SNMP. I would turn that off, probably. Maybe not. Depends on the environment. But then we can also see, well, what zones it resides in to help us better understand where it fits in the overall environment. And that's going to come in handy later on when we talk about vulnerability management. Right? We say if it's wireless, if it's routable to the business network, nothing in OT should be routable to the business network. right? Not on the OT network. Now, in the IT OT DMZ, yes, but nothing directly on the OT network itself. We'll talk about safety functions later on. But are these pieces of equipment where we have different functions that, as you might have aware, right, they're concerned with safety, ensuring safety. So that way, if a tank is about like a vessel is about to overpressurize, then we can have a safety control that detects that overpressurization condition and opens up a valve to relieve the pressure before there's an explosion. So operations and consequence. This is all great information we would use when we're going not only to do vulnerability management, but when we're conducting risk assessments in the environment. So we're going to come back and talk about this in later modules of the course. Right? Life cycle and support. Right? How are we maintaining this system? Are we maintaining this system? You see, security controls, right? If you say backup, right? Have we're actually backing it up? Have we verified that the backups work? Right? That's huge. It's one of the number one things we should be checking. And really think about it, really has nothing to do with security itself. But whether we have an incident or that machine just goes on the fritz and shorts out and we have to replace it. Are we able to restore the firmware? Are we able to restore the logic that went with that particular firmware? Are we sending logs to a SIM? Is it being monitored by some type of IDS? Yeah. That yes is wishful thinking, right? Because it's usually no in OT. And then here's one of the big ones. Have we changed the default credentials? Because remember, so many of our OT cybersecurity incidents today happen because we're not changing the default credentials on our PLCs and our HMIs and our RTUs and our IEDs, right? And the list just goes on and on. I talked about the Russians that wiped out 30 substations on the Poland grid last December, right? This is the end of 2025. They're able to do that because when they accessed those substations over VPN with stolen credentials, all of the control systems they found inside use default credentials. So they're able to log in, right, have full administrative control and wipe everything. So that's one we definitely want to make sure. I have a client that's we're working on this right now. Making sure that you don't have any default credentials in use. Even just the fact that when you bring in systems from a vendor, from an integrator, right? If you're doing like site acceptance testing, right? Check to see if default credentials are there. Do you really want that vendor to be able to access them if you're never going to see maybe that integrator ever again? Evidence and governance. We'll come back and talk about governance and compliance later on for sure. And then we mentioned risk assessment, right? How do we look at a particular asset in the environment, where it sits in the environment, and then play this game of what's going to happen if an attacker gets access to this system? What could they do in the environment, right? How bad would it be? What would be the overall impact? Worst case scenario, and then let's just say average. Like what if there's a Windows system that's infected with ransomware in the same network zone or subnet? What's the worst thing that could happen? So we have an entire section on risk assessments as well. That's the asset register. Again, that's probably going to be a lot for most organizations if they're just starting with nothing or again a Sudoku puzzle filled with holes. Do you want to build to this? Absolutely. You want to get to this level of detail because remember, it helps us not only from cybersecurity but the operations perspective. And then you can go through the rest. But this helps build out, the different menus that we have. There's risk scoring. So we're going to come back and talk about this when we're getting to things like risk assessments, right? Understanding the environment. When we get into network architecture in the next module, we're going to talk about zones and conduits. That's how we break up or segment an OT network according to ISA IEC 62443. And you can even see that mentioned up there. Remember, 62443, as we call it, is the gold standard of how we build an OT cybersecurity program. We can see remote access. That's the second most popular way that attackers gain access to OT networks. So, yeah, it's important we pay attention to that. And then I love when we can create dashboards, because not only can I use it to get a good understanding in the blink of an eye, right? Just one quick glance to understand, hey, where are we at? Where are we with our current progress? Where do we need to go? And what's next that we need to do? Right? And this is what executives want to see as well. And executives should be seeing this, right? Our leadership, our managers should be seeing this, right? Whether it's a plant manager, whether it's someone in the business, if there's a change log, and then that looks like it's it. So again, this asset register, which people would have and probably still, depending on the consultants, right, probably pay thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars in some environments, which is crazy. And here it is for free. And I would just suggest you probably will pare it down to start an environment and then build, right? Little by little, just improve it over time. Remember, be stronger tomorrow than we are today. And don't forget, I put a copy of the register in the download section for this lesson. So you'll have it there. And I hope it comes in helpful. So now that we've talked about what asset registers are, why they're important, and how we can build out a template, and you saw how pretty detailed that template was. We start thinking about the asset register. Even if I walk into an environment and they say they have an asset register, like I was just in an environment where they had equipment that was sent over by a vendor that was built overseas. They're like, here's the asset register or what's in the plant. It's like, okay, great, but how do we know that's 100% accurate? Because I started going through the list, walking through the environment and starting to compare what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing different things like even engineering workstations that weren't on the asset register, but they're in the OT network. So, yes, we want the asset to register to be 100% accurate at all times. I just never assume that it's going to be, but we do want to make sure that it is as close to 100% as possible. Changes happen in any OT environment, right? What if a PLC goes on the fritz? Yeah, not a cyber attack. It's just it's an electronic piece of equipment that shorts out. Right? It gets fried, and you have to replace it. So what happens if they replace that, but then they don't update the asset register? Maybe they put the same firmware and the same logic and the same IP address on it, but the MAC address on that new PLC should definitely be different. We have to make sure any changes in the environment go through the authorized channels. So that way, when those changes are made, the asset register gets updated. What if a PLC tech brings in their own laptop to act as an engineering workstation? Right? So they're going to connect their own laptop to the network to then maybe put new firmware on a PLC or put PLC logic changes right on the asset. The problem with that, well, there's a couple things. One, asset register isn't up to date. More importantly, we don't know where that laptop's been. And it could be compromised. It could be infected. And then we just have attackers in the environment. I had an environment one time where I got a call through an entity essentially that was helping the NSA in the United States to let us know that there were North Korean state actors on the network, which of course we went into immediate overdrive to figure out what was going on. Thankfully, jump in the SIM, only took a minute or two to actually realize what was happening. It was actually two contractors from South Korea that were on the guest Wi-Fi, which wasn't connected to the corporate or OT networks at all. And so thankfully no harm, no foul. But think what happens when people bring in laptops, especially ones you have no control over. Should we even allow that? Not if we can help it, right? But just think of, if that's supposed to be permanent, right? How does that impact the asset register, right? Which should be impacted. But again, we shouldn't allow people to bring in their personal systems and connect to the network. But I've seen this multiple times. Heck, I've been in the position where I'm like, oh, it would be so much easier for me just to bring my laptop and it'd be so much faster than what we have in the plan. But obviously, we don't want to take those steps for security purposes because we don't know if those personal assets are secure. I actually had a power plant where one of the control room operators one weekend thought it would be a great idea to bring in an Xbox and connect it to the network in the control room. I guess he thought he was going to have time over the weekend and that he would have an internet connection some way from the control room. So as soon as that thing pops up on the network, then there should be alarms going off all over the place, right? To say, hey, unauthorized device, right? Investigate, 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 right? Track down this person, track down this asset, figure out where it came from, and get it off the network. Now, if it needs to be there, right? We want it to be there, but we have to go through the appropriate change management procedures to get it installed. And then what if you have somebody that's just able to bring their own device or like a personal laptop, right, connected to the network, and then that gets an IP address through DHCP, which we don't see a lot of DHCP in OT, at least at lower levels, but I have seen at a lot of the layer 3 of the Purdue model where they do have DHCP running. So could somebody come in, plug in, and get an IP address, and then start maybe scanning the environment, start poking and prodding? But would we know? And this ties in, right? We're really building the case for things like network security monitoring, right? And watching for abnormalities over time. So we'll talk about that more in some upcoming sections. So you're starting to get the idea, though, how important the asset register is in other aspects of OT cybersecurity. Just remember, we never assume the asset register is 100% accurate because one, it never is, hardly ever. Right? But B, again, we just have to keep in the back of our mind that it's not complete. That always think we're missing something. We're missing something. And if you go by that assumption, when we're doing investigations, right, when we're doing response, when we're doing monitoring, right, you'll be so much better off. Now, where do we store the asset register? So we already talked about the most common place that people put their asset data. It's in Excel, right? It's sitting in a spreadsheet. Now, of course, then we start, well, where's that spreadsheet sitting? Is it printed out, right? And you have a million copies printed out laying around where anybody can find them, right? Is it just a million copies online, spread out all over the servers, right? Because when you start thinking about, and we talk about this later, is what would happen if an attacker gained access to the asset register, right? They would have a treasure map of the environment, right? But at least if the information is in the asset register. So think, right? Make, model, and firmware version for all of our assets, at least those, or IP addresses. Right? That's the dream for an attacker to be able to find that information. So we have to be careful. So where we're storing it. So yes, it's going to be Excel. Sometimes you might have an application that you purchase. A lot of different types of OT solutions are now building in asset registers. So like platforms like a network security monitoring tool, like a Dragos, a Clarity, and Nozomi. But I've also seen like backup applications for OT. They also help you build out and maintain an asset register. Right? Now, you couldn't put those, say, in the cloud, but that would mean that you have cloud connectivity from OT, which we do see more and more these days, right? But, and we'll get into that later, but there's a lot of considerations with that. One thing to always remember is that any cloud environment, right, every cloud environment is going to be compromised at some point in the future. So when that environment is compromised, what does that mean to you and your organization? And if your asset register is there, that's the keys to the kingdoms in a lot of respects from in the OT cybersecurity world. So we have to make sure we protect it accordingly. Now, we already talked about, right, what are we storing in the asset register? Right? Make, model, firmware version. Those are the big ones that allow us to do vulnerability management in OT. Right? Find the vulnerabilities based off of that information. Things like IP addresses also are great. Right? So that especially comes in place with network security monitoring and incident detection. Secure network architecture. That's where we talk about zones and conduits. And then a lot of this information comes into play when we talk about risk assessments. So just those few items I talked about, probably 50% at least of what we do in OT cybersecurity. And we can't do any of that effectively without the asset register. So now that we have a good understanding of what an asset register is, what it looks like, right? We've built out a template. We've talked about how important it is to make sure that it's as accurate as possible, but never assume that it's 100%. Now we can talk about, so how are we going to build the asset register? So there's 4 ways that we can build the asset register, 4 primary ways. So we talk about walking the environment, which is going to take a lot of time if we're going to talk about tracing cables, and there's a lot of issues with that. We talk about we can review existing data, so things like project files, right? Anything related to the control systems in the environment. Anywhere we can find paperwork, right, to look at. We can also look at passive monitoring of the network or packet captures, where we can look at the network traffic to see what's in the environment and start to use that to build out the asset register. And then we can talk about how we could actively scan the environment, but doing full active scanning using a tool like Nmap or Nessus is almost always and should be prohibited, and because of those safety and availability concerns. Though some environments will adopt what they call active probing. So instead of scanning all network ports, especially in TCP, they'll actually just test for maybe 1 or 2. Like if we want to see if there's any assets out there running Modbus, we'll just test for Modbus. So it's kind of a limited form of active testing. But any of this, right, any steps that you're going to take, you need to coordinate and get authorization from everybody in engineering and operations, especially the plant manager and anybody responsible for safety. Because when we talk about walking the environment, think these environments are not safe. So when you look at this image, right, we think that we're walking in an environment, this petrochemical facility, right, which is extremely dangerous. You can even look at the signs that she's not following. So we'll go ahead and fix that. So that's much better. So this is a great part when we start talking about, right, PPE that we wear in industrial environments, right, our personal protection equipment. So we have to follow the safety instructions and the requirements of the sites that we're working at. Something I always take super seriously, very seriously when I'm on site. You tell me what PPE I need to bring, what I need to wear, where I need to wear it, when I need to wear it, and I'll follow it to the letter of the law. Because safety always comes first. Our safety and the safety of those around us. And I never want to jeopardize that. So a lot of these environments, right? Again, there's real risk. Remember, it's very different than sitting at a cube in IT or working remote from home. When you talk about walking the environment, right? This is as dangerous as it gets for building an asset register. So when we think about it, like, do we need to put people in harm to build out the asset register? Not necessarily. Of course, it depends on the environment. It depends on your level of maturity. It depends on a lot of things. But in a safety first environment, this is probably going to be our last choice because of the safety implications. It also just takes a lot of time, right? If you had somebody going in maybe to a switch closet or cabinet and tracing wires throughout the facility, that takes a lot of time. So, can it be effective? Sure. But we look at the time, right, and the effort it takes, and that we're putting our team members at risk, right, for their physical safety. So, is it going to happen? Plus, we could cause issues. I actually had a friend that he and his now wife worked together as auditors, and they were in a facility that they're in the server room on the OT side, large manufacturing plant, massive company worldwide, and they're in the data center for this one OT network manufacturing, and he saw there was just a huge stack of boxes, and there, like an inch of dust, right? They hadn't been touched in years and hadn't been moved in years, and so he was just curious to see what was behind the boxes. So he just moved them like an inch, and behind there was an cheap old little switch, network switch, and then it had two Ethernet cables going into it. And he said, "Well, I have no idea what that is, so I'm not going to touch it." And he just made a note of it. And then about 30 seconds later, 20 people come running into the data center because all of production shut down. And apparently, just by moving the boxes just a little bit, it was just enough to pull one of those cables out, just enough to break the connection. And that was the connection between IT and OT, and how IT was continually feeding information to keep manufacturing operations up and running. So not only does walking the environment take a lot of time, it puts us in physical danger, and potentially, right, we knock something loose and cause a production issue. Now, there are some benefits, like it does give us a chance to look for any like physical security issues. We could look for, also like any physical safety issues that we might see. Like I go into a lot of environments lately, it seems, and there's doors that are key carded, but they're propped open. That's not what we want to see. Another thing we want to look for is PLCs and other controllers that have that key switch. Make sure that key switch is in run mode. Remember our conversation about the Trisis incident where Sandworm from Russia had put their own malicious firmware on the safety controller at that petrochemical facility in the Middle East. And they were able to do that because the controller had its key switch placed in run mode. Or those controllers all have a physical key, or sometimes you can only do it in software. Sometimes it's a little dip switch. But you always want to see those in run mode. And in that instance, the attackers were able to put their malicious firmware on the controller, on that Triconic safety controller, because the key switch wasn't in run mode. Or if it's in run mode, it will at least prevent a remote attacker from being able to place their own firmware on the machine. Or think of that as the operating system for that controller. And if you can put your own operating system on a controller, that gives you full control over everything. Some people think of it as read only, so that remote attackers can't compromise the controller. But it's only, on most controllers, it's only for the firmware. Because what you'll see, and this is actually my master's thesis, was I took 6 of the most commonly used PLCs and put them in run mode, and then started to make programming changes. And you go to make the programming change, and you just get a pop-up that says, hey, you're trying to make a programming change while you're in run mode. Are you sure you want to do this? And you just click yes. And guess what? It takes the change and you're off to the races. So we do want to see run mode, right? Key switch set to run mode, because that will prevent somebody from uploading malicious firmware or downloading malicious firmware. It's different terms in OT. But it doesn't stop somebody from putting their own PLC logic on the PLC or other type of controller. So there's some of the considerations, right? Some of the good things, but mostly the disadvantages, right? The bad things that go along with walking environment, lost time, potential safety issues, right? We could cause production problems. So everything we need to take into consideration to determine, are we going to walk the environment or not, to help build out the asset register. So we just talked about walking the environment to find assets. But we also mentioned how that could be dangerous. It could also be dangerous to production, not just ourselves, right? If we bump a wire and bring everything to a screeching halt, right? Not what we want to have happen, right? So let's look at the next way we can build an asset register is by reviewing project file data. Now, when we talk about project file data, it's any data related to a particular project. Sometimes I think of project files as if I'm programming a PLC, all that PLC logic is stored in a program file. Right? But there's a lot of other documentation around that environment and that process. So just think if you have documentation anywhere. And so some of the big ones we're looking for are network diagrams if they exist, because that's where we can at least see usually some IP addresses, maybe some labels, right? So love that. We can look at if we have documentation, especially from the original teams that engineer or design the environment. So you could find different design specifications in the environment for the different PLCs and other assets. Maybe you have documentation around how they're programmed. So you could have information, right? Little clues, those hints, right? So you're using those hints that you can find in all these different files to fill in those blanks when you're playing the Sudoku, right, with the asset register. You can go through and you can look for other documentation. So you can see on the list, right? Things like project plans and schedules. That might at least give you a hint as to what's installed in the environment. So you can see, oh, on this date, right, or this week, we installed the DCS components for the plant. Okay, well then let's track down the DCS and its different components, because we definitely want to make sure that those appear on the asset register. Now, more mature environments should have change records. So anytime, right, a new system is put in place, right, something's swapped out, an update is made, that should be recorded through the change management process. So while that should be tied into your asset register as well, so those changes should be happening, yeah, it's probably a 50-50 whether that actually is happening or not. So go back through the change records and maybe you'll find some assets in there or information about your assets that you don't have in the asset register, right? So you talk about purchase records. That was one that I came up because my last company, right? I worked at one of the world's largest engineering companies, right? We're designing and engineering and building these environments. So we were buying the equipment and we were bringing it on site and we were putting it through not only FAT testing, right, at the factory for the OEM, for the vendor, but also site acceptance testing, right, SAT. As we're going through that process and we're purchasing, right, there's that paper trail. So whether it's through the purchase or through SAT testing, make sure we take that opportunity to add that information, right, to the asset register. So you have all this paperwork you can go through. Of course, granted, that takes time. It's one, hey, you have an internal or a confidential, locked down AI platform that you can use, upload all the data. right? Again, with authorization and making sure you're not doing this to the public cloud to where anybody would have access to the data. Upload it, let AI find the information for you. It's very effective and it's very quick at doing that. Now, before we get to the next step, I did want to talk about one place we could see this. And this is where we start, we were already talking about network diagrams. So one way we can look is, well, what about network appliances? We can look in their configurations. That's a form of paperwork, right? But also they have the ARP table on each of them that can allow us to see all of the different IP addresses and MAC addresses that they see communicating on the network. And so that's a great place, at least to start, get IP addresses and MAC addresses if we have absolutely nothing else, right? So, we can go from network diagrams. Again, this I think is a good, simple, straight, basic example. Right? It's very clear, again, simple to read. Here's labels, here's IP addresses. We have icons that try to show us, right? Firewall, data historian, right? Remote access server. I can see those things readily available, right? All the way down to right level 0, where we have the different instrumentation and we start seeing real world equipment. So we can go from network diagrams to, well, at the network, right? The network's brought together by the network infrastructure, right? All of our switches. So when you look at, and this is from, you can see a stack of Cisco switches. And that's the ones I'm most familiar with. And I still see probably more Cisco in more environments in OT, just as in IT. Doesn't always have to be, right? But I still probably see more Cisco than anything. So what if I log into that Cisco switch? And you'll have a lab one to run through to give you a simple login to a simulated Cisco switch and be able to search for pieces of information that you would want to include in the asset register. Like in this case, you can see there's an IP address. And then you might say, well, that's it. Or, well, we can also see, hey, there's something called PLC one. It's like, oh, okay, well, if that's labeled right, probably have a PLC that we need to track down. And same thing with, a firewall and a valve. And so the list goes on and on and on, potentially, and what we can see in the switch. Maybe not a lot from the config, but maybe. Where we get a lot of benefit from logging into those switches is not necessarily from the config itself, right? But looking at the ARP cache. And the ARP cache on a switch will show us every IP address and MAC address that's communicating through that switch. And so you can see in this case, there's not only multiple VLANs, but we can see again those IP addresses and the MAC addresses for those different hosts. Now you can start to see that there are some MAC addresses that are the same. Right. And if you look at those, well, they're also associated with the .1 address on each of those subnets. So guess what this is for, right? That's probably the interfaces for the network switch itself. So the network switch, right, has one interface with one IP address and one MAC address. And then we go back and we add additional IP addresses to the interface so it can talk to all these other VLANs or these other subnets. So that's what might look a little strange if you're looking at individual MAC addresses, because sometimes you will find systems, right, that have multiple IP addresses for a single MAC address. Now we're talking about ARP, right? So what is ARP? Talk about address resolution protocol. So in the TCP/IP world, when we have systems communicating with each other, right, they're talking IP address to IP address. Well, the IP addresses are logical addresses that we give to those systems to make it easier for us to remember 192.168.1.8 versus a MAC address. Remember, the MAC address is that 48-bit address written in hex. 08B1, blah, that gets really ugly. So every system has that physically assigned MAC address, right, to its network interface. But we're not going to remember that. We're going to assign it an IP address that makes it easier to remember. It's kind of also like if we take it out another level, it's how on the internet, right, we assign fully qualified domain names, right, to IP addresses. So I know if I want to go McDonald's.com, right? That more than likely, yeah, I don't have to remember the IP address or the MAC address associated with the web server for McDonald's.com. I just type McDonald's.com in my web browser and it go there. So looking at ARP, take a step back. Remember, ARP is a protocol that allows us to resolve IP addresses to MAC addresses. Remember, we assign logical IP addresses to make it easy for us to remember and work with from an administrative perspective. But really, when two systems communicate, they're not talking IP address to IP address. They're really talking MAC address to MAC address. So we use ARP, which is a broadcast. So we send out a packet that goes to everybody on the local network and say, hey, if you have this IP address, if you have 192.168.1.8, I want to talk with you. Tell me what your MAC address is. And so if there is a system out there at 192.168.1.8, it'll respond back and say, oh, yeah, I'm here. Here's my MAC address. That's ARP. So it allows us to find the MAC addresses for different IP addresses. So we can use an ARP broadcast on the local subnet to find assets that are out there responding to ARP. And that's going to be almost every asset in the TCP/IP world. Even those assets that are configured not to respond maybe to ICMP, which we use for ping. Some people say, well, we're going to block ping because we're not going to allow somebody to find the asset on the network by pinging it. Okay, but they can probably do an ARP scan to still find it because it's going to still respond to that ARP request. It has to for communication. And ARP traffic is also often discussed in the OT world as the one type of active scanning technique that you can safely use because these systems, right, actually are used to seeing ARP traffic and they don't crash. A lot of these systems, when they first turn on, one of the things they'll do is do an ARP broadcast to say, hey, here's my IP address and here's my MAC address. Now, it might not ever do that again until it gets rebooted, and that might be years down the road. But so ARP can be seen as, again, work with engineering and operations to understand if this is safe for your environment, but to do an ARP broadcast to find out what systems have IP addresses on the network. So we can look at what ARP looks like in Wireshark. So we can use Nmap as a tool to create an ARP broadcast on the local subnet. Right? And you can see in Wireshark, this is what it looks like. Can you see it has ARP protocol? You can see the MAC address that it's coming from. So that's my machine. You can see where it's going to. Since it's broadcast traffic, the destination is FFFFFFFFF, right? Or a destination IP address of 255.255.255.255, which means that packet goes to every computer on the local subnet. It doesn't get routed to other subnets. It just stays on that one subnet. And then you can see the scan. It's just literally saying, hey, 10.2.1.1, if you're out there, let me know. I'm at 10.2.1.252. Hey, 10.2.1.2. Hey, if you're out there, let me know. I'm at 10.2.1.252. Right? It just goes through and it's trying to reach out to every single possible IP address on that subnet. It says, hey, if you're there, let me know. And then you can get responses. This is what it actually looks like in Nmap. And so in Nmap, we use the -SN parameter to send the ARP traffic. And then this is, you can see this is just on my home network. So you can see a lot of my, like the Roku TV and the Amazon Alexa, but you get the idea, right? Or we can generate that ARP traffic to get a response from each of the systems running IP on that local network. And then it'll come back, and if there's a host error, it says, oh, hey, yeah, I'm sitting at 10.2.1.247. And here's my MAC address, 44.6D7F. And then we can take the first half of that MAC address, look it up in the IEEE database, or use the one that Wireshark has and Nmap. And then you can see, oh, that's Amazon. So going back to finding systems based off of ARP. So we can do a scan. Again, we still active scanning always is something we want to avoid. But if there was one type of active scanning you would do in an environment, it would be an ARP broadcast. But you can also go to different systems in the environment and look at their ARP cache to see who they've been talking to, and they'll have an IP address and a MAC address. Now, they don't store this information indefinitely. It's only there for a short period of time. But especially if you have two assets that talk on a regular basis, then you'll have a good shot of getting an IP address and a MAC address. So you can see on Windows, you can use ARP-A to get your ARP cache. Linux, you can, depending on the form of Linux, right? It depends. You can say ARP, or there you can cat the ARP file in proc/net. So there's different ways to find MAC addresses and IP addresses. And in this case, right, it doesn't require us to actually do any type of active scanning. We can just take the time to go to each of those resources and pull the ARP caches and see if, hey, are there any IP addresses or MAC addresses that are missing? I'm actually working with a client on this right now. So the next method we're going to talk about in building asset registers is active scanning, right? So this should be the least used option. I do want to cover it. And we'll see how active scanning has evolved, and that some environments use what we call active polling in limited use to reduce the risk of active scanning, right? Crashing an asset like a PLC, or just bringing the network down. Maybe it generates too much traffic for the network infrastructure to handle, and the network falls down, and then nothing is talking to anything else. So when we talk about active scanning, remember this is where we're talking about generating network packets, putting them out on the wire to send to targets. And that we're looking for live hosts, right? IP addresses typically, right? Open ports, right? And then the software, the services associated with those ports, and the version of those software services and the hardware, right? So we can find the firmware version associated with those pieces, and then we can use that to look up what vulnerabilities exist on those assets. Now, we also have to remember, like we talked about in the last module, right, that while most environments these days in the OT world run all of their protocols over TCP/IP, there's older serial versions of those protocols, right, that they're not on TCP/IP. So it means you're not discovering them with an Nmap scan. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because especially if you're in an older plant, or maybe even a newer plant that has a smaller kind of isolated network, that's where you have to interview the operators and the engineers to understand if you have any of these kind of isolated networks. They either can't be reached by TCP/IP because they're not routable, maybe they're segregated, or again, maybe they're running those older serial protocols that don't communicate with TCP/IP. Unless maybe you find one of those. Remember, we had the serial to Ethernet gateway or the adapter. But of course, since we're talking about active scanning, we have to talk about why we don't do active scanning, right, in OT, because of the threat to safety and availability. Well, what does that really mean? There's a couple of things that I've seen, and honestly, about a year or two ago, I started to kind of back off on this a little bit, and then I started hearing all these other stories about plants crashing and coming down, including multiple power plants with blackouts because of somebody running Nmap or Nessus in the environment that shouldn't be. So when we start looking at, if I'm generating network packets and I'm putting on a network and I'm sending them out, one of the reasons that we have failures in OT is because older, right, legacy systems, they weren't designed to handle packets that they didn't understand. They would get this packet from Nessus or Nmap and literally just choke and die. The memory in the processor just dies. Sometimes where the machine had to be rebooted, sometimes where it was bricked and it had to be replaced just by not being able to understand what's being received. Now, a lot of those issues have been accommodated for over time. But I had a friend that he's in Amsterdam. This just goes back about 9 months, was talking about how they had somebody running Nmap in their manufacturing environment. Production came to a halt and they found open up the cabinet that had 10 PLCs and there's just little whiffs of smoke coming out of each of them. So even in newer environments with newer equipment, it still can actually have an impact, believe it or not. Again, I've heard the horror stories just last year at DEF CON about people from 2 different power plants, one in the US and one in Europe, came to me and talked about, in one is somebody was using Nmap where they shouldn't, another they had pen testers, pretty much IT pen testers in the OT environment and caused a blackout. Thankfully, that one was in a maintenance window. So you either see the different assets fail because of the scans. And again, this is with the latest firmware and latest models in a lot of environments. Or what you also see is that some of these environments, they don't have managed switches. Means they have poor network infrastructure. Or maybe they have managed switches, but those switches are oversubscribed, which means they're already running at 100% processor and they're already running at 100% memory. So as soon as you just add a little bit more on top of that from a network scan, right? Those managed switches will fail. Right? The network comes crashing down because you just sucked up all the hardware. Or in unmanaged switches, right? You can just generate traffic, and then unmanaged switches, they're not configured to switch, right? Move packets from A to B correctly or efficiently or in an optimized condition, and to the point where it gets jumbled, it gets confused, and the traffic just builds up and up and up until you take up all the bandwidth and the network comes crashing down and then nothing's communicating. So that's why we don't do active scanning in the environment. If you are, you need to do it with authorization and you need to do it in coordination with operations and engineering. So this is what we were just talking about, right? The idea that active scanning generates packets, right? Puts them out on the network. Right? We're typically not going to allow this in OT because, right, if we crash an asset, our process fails, that could become a safety issue very quickly, or the plant goes down and we're not generating whatever service or product we're supposed to be generating. But we're going to talk about how network scanning works at a fundamental level using Nmap, right? The most commonly used port scanner out there. It was actually created by Fyodor. I remember the first time I went to DEF CON, this was like 25 years ago. I remember seeing Fyodor, right? Gordon Lyon. He was actually writing his book on Nmap, and he was just handwriting it, right? And that's all he was doing this entire time, except for when he was speaking. And it really showed just how dedicated he was. Right? It seemed like super nice guy. Did not meet him, right? But you can find Nmap at insecure.org, right? So you can download it there. You can run it on just about everything, right? It's on Windows and Linux, on Mac, and you find it already installed on a lot of things. It's actually there was a study recently about there was a brand new Mercedes that the entertainment dashboard is run by a Linux version, and it had Nmap built in. And they were like, "Why do we have this here?" It's because they just didn't remove it. So a lot of distros still kind of have Nmap thrown in there. It used to be all of them back in the day. So there's a GUI version called ZenMap. I'm not a fan, but to each their own. Right? The current version as of today in August 2026 is 7.99. So almost to 8. I'm not sure if there's any big changes coming, but I mean it's been around for, I think, right, 25 years and change. So, and I have a bunch of quick start guides that I've created, just like I created for Shodan and back in the day, and there's updated versions. So I'll also include those in the download links for this section of the course. Here's the one that I created for LinkedIn. So it's a slightly newer version, but you see it hones in on the basics. So there's the first thing we talked about is the art scan that we were just talking about, right, in the last lesson, right? Or how we do port scanning, or how this works in OT, right? Or here's some common OT ports to look for. So again, I'll put this in the download section for this lesson. So when we're doing active scanning in an environment, this is whether it's OT or IT, right? The idea is we're looking for a couple of things. First, we start by looking for the live hosts that are in the environment, right? I want to find the IP addresses. I want to find the computers or the PLCs and the HMIs that are connected to the network, right? I want to find those assets. Then for each of those assets, I want to find out what ports are open. Because if I see TCP 3389, right, what would that be? If you're familiar, TCP 3389, that's used for Microsoft Windows Remote Desktop. So almost always, right, that's going to be a Windows machine. At a very basic minimum, I know it's a Windows box, boom. Versus if I see something like TCP 502, we've been talking about, right? TCP 502 is used for Modbus. And so it's like, if I see TCP 502, that's probably a PLC. So that's partly why we like open ports, so we can start understanding not only, hey, there's an asset at this IP address, but based off of the open ports, hey, it's Windows. So it's a server or a workstation, or, oh, look, hey, there's Modbus over here. That's probably a PLC. So once we find those open ports, then we want to, what's behind that port? What service or what application is running there, right? Who's the vendor? Because we can take that vendor information to then learn even more, right, about that asset and what its role is in the environment. So then we look for, well, what version of that software or that service is running there? Because remember, we can use the version information with things like make and model, the vendor or the software application, right, to look up, are there any known vulnerabilities on this system? Right? And I'm working with a team right now at one of my clients, going through their asset register and looking for known vulnerabilities based off of make, model, firmware version. Now, again, this section's on active scanning. So one way we would start active scanning potentially, right, besides the ARP broadcast we talked about earlier, is we can do a ping sweep. Now remember, we talked a little bit before also, is as we're running different tools, one way to get a better understanding of how those tools work is to run Wireshark at the same time. Remember, Wireshark we can use to see what's going on at the network level. Watch the packets to get a better understanding of how the tools work. So you can say, hey, I want to run nmap-s capital P, which will do this ping sweep. So the idea is it sends a ping or an ICMP echo request to every IP address on that network, right? And that could be a remote network as well, right? Remember, our broadcast, that was only for the local subnet. You had to be plugged into it. Ping sweeps can work on remote assets. Now, a ping sweep like this actually generates more than just an ICMP echo request packet. It's doing more than ping. It'll actually also check to see if TCP 80 is running on each of these systems. So if you're just looking at it on the surface, right, you might think, oh, this ping sweep is safe, but what if testing port 80, that's too much in an OT environment? And that was definitely the case back in the day. That could still be the case in some environments in 2026. But I would never have known that activity was happening if I hadn't watched the Nmap scan in Wireshark. So we can find hosts by doing the ping sweep. Then once we find active IP addresses, then we want to come back and do a port scan. Now, in the TCP/IP world, all right, each system has TCP ports and it has UDP ports. Remember, TCP was guaranteed traffic, guaranteed delivery, and then UDP was non-guaranteed, right? You just send the UDP traffic and you assume it gets to where it's going, and that's it. TCP, we send a little data, we get a return receipt. We send a little data, we get a return receipt. So there's a lot of overhead. It's slower, but there's that guaranteed delivery of traffic. So there are 65,535 TCP ports on every host running TCP/IP, and there's 65,535 UDP ports. Now, because UDP has that connectionless nature about it, it's impossible really to test those ports. So you can test them, but it's extremely slow. So you're only going to test a couple, like a handful of UDP ports. And even then, the results are iffy. You'll see what I mean. In TCP, because of that connection request, that's what we're measuring with Nmap to determine, hey, is this port open or not? Or maybe it's firewalled. So we're going to get into that as well. Now, when we're scanning ports, remember, there's 65,535 TCP ports, especially. We're going to focus mostly on those. Now, over time, they try to standardize those. So they're trying to say like anything between 1,000 and 1,023, those are well-known ports. Like if I say port 80, TCP port 80, oh, you might say, well, that's for HTTP. That's for a web page, non-encrypted web page, right? If I say TCP 4443, you might say, oh, that's for an encrypted web page over HTTPS. TCP 502, oh, that's Modbus, right? So the idea is that these ports are supposed to be reserved for those specific uses. But remember, you can put an application or a service on any port. You want to put Modbus on 44,219. You can. Now, will that break a process? Probably, right? But there is nothing to prevent you from doing that. So keep that in the back of your mind for a moment. We're going to come back to that. So they try to give you, hey, anything under 1,024, that's reserved, right? Well, no, you shouldn't even try to use those. Now you can see 1,024 to 49,151. These are registered. I'm like, are they? And 49,000 plus, you can do whatever you want with. Pretty much anybody does whatever they want, especially with anything over, a couple of thousand, right? So you'll see people spinning up services and applications, like with the simulators we have, right? We spin up things like HMI web interfaces on port 55555, right? I'm not really worried about registered versus free ports. Remember, again, anybody can put anything they want on any port, as long as it just doesn't break a process. So when we go through port scanning, right, the idea is that we want to test a number of those ports to see, hey, is it open? Like in OT, the easiest way to bring down the network is try to scan every possible IP address for every possible port, and you're just generating a vast amount of traffic, right? And if that environment's going to crash, it probably would crash under that. Right? So we might say, hey, I just want to scan this subnet to see, can I find TCP 502? I'm just looking for hosts that are running Modbus on the default port. That's all, right? And then we can come back and start talking about, right, how we build into like services and applications and versions and looking for vulnerabilities. But we're going to just scan a limited number of hosts. Remember, here we're talking about, TCP, it's connection oriented, right? We get that return receipt. UDP, no return receipt, but it's faster. Watching Netflix, let's stream it over UDP, right? I'm sending an email, let's go ahead and use TCP. I want to make sure it gets to where it's going. Right? We want to make sure the data makes it across. Now, one thing before we start looking at how the Nmap scan works for TCP, I have to realize that when we talk about TCP as this connection-oriented protocol, right? That happens because of the three-way handshake. So when two computers first want to talk to each other, two hosts running TCP/IP want to talk to each other. Maybe it's an HMI and a PLC, or in this case, it's an engineering workstation and a server. Right? The idea is that the computer that wants to talk with or one asset wants to talk to another asset, right? Asset A will send what they call a SYN packet, synchronization packet, that says, hey, I want to talk to you. Now, normally the recipient will come back and say, hey, I want to talk to you too. Awesome, right? And they exchange a little information about, hey, this is how fast we can send information. This is how fast I can receive it. This is how we'll do error checking, right? I'll make sure I send you some return receipts. So they set all that up. But when you set up communication in TCP/IP, it's actually only for one direction. So the idea is you would have to do this for both directions. So you would send a SYN packet, and then you would get an ACK packet back, which would establish that connection. And then the recipient, right, they would have to do the same thing to set up communication in the other direction. They would send you a SYN packet, and then you would send an ACK packet back. Well, I realized, well, instead of sending 4 packets, right, because back in the day, right, bandwidth was at a premium, that don't send 4 packets, right? We can take those 2 middle packets and we combine them into one, right? So we send that SYN packet, say, hey, I want to talk to you. So the computer, the recipient, right, that asset says, hey, I want to talk to you too. So it sends an acknowledgement, but at the same time, it also sends you its SYN packet and says, hey, I want to talk to you too. And you're like, oh, okay. So it sends that final acknowledgement. So it sets up, sure, it looks like two-way communication, and it is, but remember, it's really 2 one-way forms of communication. But we're measuring that SYN-ACK ACK process with Nmap to determine whether a port is open or not. So this is what we mean. You'll see in a sec. Now there's different flags, right? And these pop up in the header of the packet. And we were talking about the OSI layers, and we were adding the packet information or the header information onto the packets, right? To allow them to get to their destination, right? And be processed to move that data from A to B, right? SYN and ACK, right? Those are packet flags, right? We see in the header. And we'll come back and we'll see those in Wireshark. And I have a lab later to work with those as well. So the most basic form of Nmap scan is what they call the SYN scan. Right? And what's going to happen is that, let's say I'm sitting there at my machine and we're not doing this in OT, right? We're going to do this in IT. So I send a SYN scan to a port. So let's say TCP port 80. So I want to see if it's running a web server. If there's a web server there, if that port is open, it'll send the response back, right? And I get a SYN-ACK. If I get a SYN-ACK back when I send that SYN packet, I know, yeah, the port's open. It talked to me. I'm done, right? I have the information that I need. This is one of those problems that can, sometimes cause problems in OT, because in this case, we don't send the final ACK. And so the system just sits there and it's just like waiting. Now, most systems now are tuned and programmed to know, hey, if somebody tries to open up a connection and you don't hear back, you don't get that final ACK, then okay, just stop waiting for them. Don't wait forever. Because some older machines just used to wait and wait and wait and wait till they took up all their connections and then they die, right? But we can measure the SYN. If we send a SYN to a port and we get a SYN-ACK back, it means, yeah, we talk with the port and the port messages us back. We know it's open, right? That's how we know, yeah, ports are open, right? Boom. Awesome. Now, what if, right, we go ahead and send the SYN flag or the packet, right? And then we get a reset ACK back. I'm like, oh, this is a different combination. And so this means, well, we actually did talk with the port, right? So we were able to talk with the computer on that port, but the computer was saying, like, the operating system just came back and said, hey, there's no port here. There's no open port. It's actually telling us, right? There is literally no port. You're trying port 80 on me. I don't have port 80 open, right? So the port is closed. So if we send, right, SYN-ACK or a SYN and we get SYN-ACK back, we know, oh, port's open. If we send a SYN and we get reset ACK back, then we know, okay, port is closed. So we still know, okay, we're talking with that asset, right? So there's no firewall in place yet because we have that communication. Remember, we talked to the port and then it said, hey, there's nothing here. Like, oh, okay, thanks for letting us know. So where that does get different is, well, what if there is a firewall between us and that remote system and we send the SYN packet? If there's a firewall and it's blocking the traffic, then we're the ones, right? Just sitting there and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting until we finally decide, you know what? I never got an answer back, right? I didn't see a final acknowledgement, or I didn't see a SYNAC packet. I didn't see a reset ACK. I'm just going to assume, you know what? There's a firewall between me and that other computer, right? So boom, it's filtered. So there's the three states of ports that we measure, right? Open, closed, and filtered. So this is what Nmap looks like, right? So this is that default scan. You can say I'm just scanning this IP address, right? Scan, and I see a bunch of ports. In this case, I see a bunch of Microsoft associated ports. So I would know, it's like, oh, okay, this is a Windows machine. Okay, well, and that's good to know. And remember, we have a lot of Windows machines in OT. Now, by default, Nmap only scans the most commonly used 1,000 ports on the internet. So Fyodor, who created Nmap, he scanned the entire internet. And then took all those results to compile a list of the top 1,000 ports. So industrial control protocols are not on that list. So things like Modbus and S7 that we've been talking about, like ports 502 and port 102, they are not part of the top 1,000 ports. You have to test for those separately, right? It was interesting when Fyodor did that. He tells a story about how his ISP calling, right? Because he he got a couple of racks in a data center, right, to set up all these systems to scan the entire internet. And then he starts scanning the entire internet, and they call him, and because they think he's under attack, because he's getting all these responses back from his scans, they think he's under a distributed denial of service attack, right? And he's like, "Oh no, it's just me scanning the entire internet." And they were like, "Oh, okay, never mind." Those were the days, right? But just remember, the default Nmap scan only scans, right, for the top 1,000 ports. And that does not include any of the industrial protocols. Right? But remember, that's just 1,000. There's 65,535 TCP ports. Remember, there's also 65,535 UDP ports as well. So you can scan all ports. I remember this used to be undocumented in the talk I saw back at DEF CON 25 years ago. This is where, like, he actually mentioned, oh, you can do -p- and it'll just do all 65,535 TCP ports. Like, oh, wow, right? So in this instance, scanning that same Windows host, now you can see, oh, there's a lot more ports open than we were just scanning the 1,000. So it's a big, problem we have. People just assume, oh, I just did an Nmap scan, but I didn't find anything. Well, you just scanned the most common 1,000, right? If you scan a PLC with Nmap, probably you're not going to find anything. Remember, because it doesn't test for things like Modbus. Right? And we'll see some examples of those later on. Right? And so here you can see those two scans next to each other. One scanning for just the top 1,000 ports and one scanning for all 65,535. So we found some additional open ports. Remember, it's key because each of those open ports, yes, it's a program, it's an application, it's a service, but more than it's an entry point into that system. And what if it has a vulnerability that allows us to use that entry point, sometimes very easily, right? But don't forget, there's 65,535 UDP ports as well. We can scan for UDP ports, but again, remember, the whole premise of how Nmap works, for TCP, it's based off of watching the SYN, the SYNAC, and the ACK. That's because TCP is a connection-oriented protocol. UDP has nothing of that, right? We just put data on the wire and we assume it gets to where it's getting. That's it, right? Now, what if I test something like SNMP, the simple network management protocol is still common to see in OT environments. That runs on UDP 161. So if I test that and it's open, it'll actually respond back and say, hey, I'm SNMP. So in that case, I know, okay, the port's open. But even if it's a UDP service that maybe it just sits there and listens and it doesn't respond, I'll never know if it's open. Now, some systems are configured to send a response back and said, hey, you're trying to reach a port that doesn't exist. So you can get an ICMP port unreachable message. So if you get one of those, you're like, okay, the port is closed. So that's possible. But a lot of times you're just sitting there waiting for nothing, right? But that's one way we can do with UDP to understand whether a port is open or not. Again, we don't test for a lot of UDP in OT. Very few ports. You don't really test probably for a ton in IT either, right? But maybe a dozen or so. There's probably less than 4 or 5 in OT. NTP, SNMP, right? There are a few industrial protocols that also run over UDP. Like we talked about Ethernet and SIP, right? So Ethernet IP with port 44818. There's a TCP version, and there's also a UDP version. So that we can test for. Shodan actually even tests for both TCP and UDP on 44818. So, and we'll see some more examples of that, especially when we get into the OSINT module. So again, it's a little tricky, and a lot of times you just end up with these results that says it might be open, it might be filtered, it might be closed. Like, doesn't help. And this is kind of what it looks like. Again, you can kind of see, hey, we can see, 53 is open for DNS, but then you can see for DHCP, it's testing on 68 and 69. It says open/filtered. It's like, which is it? Like, we don't know. So remember, if we get ICMP port unreachable, it means, okay, we'll count that port is closed. Anything else, if it doesn't respond and we don't get ICMP port unreachable, we don't know. Could be open, could be filtered. We're just sitting here waiting. So again, UDP is a little bit tricky. So we can scan not only individual hosts, we can scan across entire subnets, right? Which you can see here. I always love to go off of examples, right? You can actually use Nmap to do individual host if you want, right? You can do commas if you want. You can do dashes. You can use wildcards. There's a lot of options. I mean, usually I think most people are scanning either a single IP address or the entire subnet, right? But there's options. Now, another thing that I've done a lot of times in the past is you can bring in a list of IP addresses, right? And then you can say, hey, Nmap, scan everything in this list using -I capital L, right? Perfect, right? And then you can do exclusion. So if you know you have sensitive systems, don't scan. I remember a long time, like 20 years ago, this is probably 16 years ago, back in the IT world, where if you scan these 2 Exchange servers at this one really big law firm that I was doing work for, that the Exchange servers, right, their mail server for like 4,000 lawyers would crash. Obviously not what you want to have happen in one of the biggest law firms in the world with 4,000 lawyers, right? That bill out at $300 an hour minimum. That was 16 years ago. So we can make exclusions. Again, we can scan an entire subnet to see what's out there, right? Now, I love the open switch, and this is where you can see we're scanning an entire subnet for Modbus, right? Nmap and then 10.2.1.0/24-P502. Now we're also doing dash S capital V for a service scan, which we're going to come back and talk about. But we're also doing dash dash open. Because what's going to happen if you don't do dash dash open is you're going to scan the subnet that has a possible 254 hosts, right, on that subnet. And you're just going to get nothing, 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 nothing. You're just going to get this long list of closed ports. And then one maybe, oh, open. So you have to go through that entire list to find. It's like, you know what? Don't show me all the garbage. Doesn't matter. Just show me where the port is open. Right? And that's what we're doing here. And then the service scan actually tells Nmap, hey, once you find TCP 502, you know what? That's probably Modbus. Let's make sure it is and try to figure out what type of Modbus it is. And here you can say it just does additional testing and say, yeah, it's Modbus over TCP. So that is active scanning. Now, I did want to mention, and we come back and talk about this more later. Again, we typically will say active scanning is prohibited in production OT environments, right? I'll never suggest anybody does it in production. But what some people have started to do is what they call active polling, right? What active polling means is we're not going in and scanning the entire network, and we're not scanning for all 65,535 TCP ports, which is just going to increase the risk that something crashes and then has a cascading safety or availability impact. We're just going to say, hey, I'm just going to test for Modbus, right? Maybe on just the local subnet. Maybe I'll just do it one IP address at a time and real slow. So that way you're decreasing the chance of anything bad happening. Right? Some people might test for SNMP, right? We can connect to that service and we can get different pieces of information about that host and see, oh, hey, it's a Siemens PLC and it has these different modules, hardware modules, and it has great. So that's active polling. There's just very limited type of active scanning where it's maybe like testing one port at a time, maybe even just one IP address at a time. So it reduces the risk of us causing any networking or asset crashing any assets. We're not testing all 65,535 ports across an entire subnet all at once. So that's active polling. And you do see that start to become more popular. And you see that also in asset vulnerability management, platforms. I think a lot of other security solutions are adding that as well. So they can just check, and then they can do maybe even some basic vulnerability checking. But again, you have to be very careful, right, of what we're actually testing because we don't want to crash that remote machine. So again, any scanning you're doing, coordinate with operations and engineering, and hopefully you have the opportunity to test those different techniques in an actual test environment with some of those assets before you're trying to do this in production. Again, which I can never recommend that you do. So the last method we have for building out an asset register is, and some people use the term passive scanning. I hate that because we're not scanning anything. We talk about passive listening or packet sniffing, right? Watching what's going on the network. So we can use, if you want, passive scanning or again, passive listening, right? Watching what's happening on the network to find assets, right? If I see two hosts communicating over TCP/IP, I have two IP addresses. I have two MAC addresses at least that I can start to work with, right? And if we work in an environment where there is no active scanning allowed, then this is going to be our best bet, right? And we're going to come back and talk about this more in the network security monitoring section. Again, this idea that we can watch traffic to find out what's in the environment and try to build that asset register, not just with IP addresses and MAC addresses, but who is the vendor? Can we get a make? Can we get a firmware version? Sometimes that's available in industrial protocols that are sent over the wire. Not all the time, right? So it's not perfect. None of these solutions we're talking about to build an asset register are perfect. So as we've already talked about earlier in the course, right? We can use Wireshark to examine not only watch traffic as it goes over the wire, but to go back and read previously captured traffic, right? We can open up those packet capture files. Again, depending on the protocol and then that point in time where we're actually capturing that traffic, maybe we do catch where they're actually sending things like vendor, model, firmware version, right? Where we can catch that information and use it to populate the asset register without having to walk the plan or do active scanning. We have that ability. So we can go and we can look at those packet captures. And you see, we can look at another example here where you can see that from the GitHub repository. So we can download that capture and look at it. So in this case, right, we're going to use a couple of features that we hadn't talked about that come with Wireshark. So you see there's a menu option under statistics for endpoints, conversations, and protocol hierarchy. Those are the three that we're going to talk about. Right, there are some other ones there, and a lot of that can help in things like troubleshooting. But when we talk about building an asset register, we're going to talk about endpoints, conversations, and protocol hierarchy. So here's what you see with endpoints, right? If you're actually looking at that one packet capture and following along. So you can see, right, on the left-hand side, here's the IP addresses that are talking. It's interesting because oh, I'm not just seeing internal IP addresses, but I'm also seeing a 166.161 address that's routed on the internet. So we have, in this case, right, looking at do we have an host on the OT network communicating with a host out on the internet? That's obviously something that we don't want to have happen, right? Because we have to at least assume initially that that's an attacker with access into OT. Now, more than likely, it's probably a vendor, right, that has set up that connection without your knowledge, and you're just finding it now, right? So it's more of a working with your vendors on awareness and education. Why we don't allow just by default any OT asset to talk with any IP address out on the internet. This is something that we should be continually looking for, right? I wish I saw more environments. Even once they have that firewall between IT and OT, they need to be watching the traffic, right? Do we have any OT hosts trying to talk with anybody on the internet? Right? We shouldn't have that happen by default. If we're going to start publishing information to IT or the internet, we have to do that through secure channels. And remember earlier we were talking about OPC UA and MQTT as a secure way, right, to be able to take data, not only give it context, but take data from OT, give it to IT, and then also push out to the cloud. So for now, though, again, with the endpoints, we can see what IP addresses exist, and you can also see what MAC addresses exist on the Ethernet tab. And then we can also see, in this case, right, like looks like we have some communication with the outside world that we probably don't want. Now, conversations is a little different look because you can see which assets are talking to each other. So this might or might not help you build out your register, right? Sometimes though it could lead you down conversation, right? Because you already have IP addresses, but now we see, oh, 10.0.0.9 is talking with 10.0.0.3. And we know, okay, well, 10.0.0.9, let's say, is a engineering workstation. So what's dot three? If we don't know what dot three is, right? We can start having those questions. So again, it's kind of going back to playing Sudoku, right? Building out this asset register, but it's, more clues to help build out that overall big picture. And the protocol hierarchy is just probably not necessarily directly helping with the asset register, but it's good background information, and it's great anytime you just jump into a new packet capture. I always pull up the protocol hierarchy to see, okay, what's really inside of this packet capture, right? And you can see it's broken down, kind of going back to that OSI model, right? Down to down, starting at those lower levels and then building up. So we see network protocols into transport protocols into those, I think those protocols that are running are seen as running at the application layer. So in this case, we can see, oh, okay, 66% of this packet capture has Modbus traffic in it. Now, I do like to talk about Network Miner. Network Miner is a cool little, some people say it's like a Wireshark replacement. That's not what Network Miner is meant to do. But what Network Miner does is it does take a packet capture and it does sort through it. And then it does identify the host and the IP addresses. And then it tries to pull in identifying pieces of information. So it's trying to give you really the information you're looking for your asset register, which is, again, one of the reasons why I like talking about it. Because here you can see, okay, we take this packet capture, we put it into Network Miner, and then we can see, oh yeah, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hosts. And then it tries to label them based off of operating system by the communications it's seeing. So it's seeing a lot of Windows hosts. It sees a Mac. It sees some unknown host at this, remember, that public IP address out on the internet. And then everything else again looks like it's Windows. So not only can it pull out when you look at operating systems, but you can see here it's also pulling out other pieces of information, like the MAC address that we can need. Remember, we could take that first half of the MAC address and we can map it to the vendor, right? That's also information, yeah, we need to put inside the asset register. So it's a one way, right, to get a kind of a visualization, and potentially it finds additional pieces of information for you. But at least it's a nice little GUI to pull out some of that information. But that's passive sniffing. So we're using Wireshark and Network Miner to look at packet captures to find hosts and as much information about those. Okay, it's just they're not perfect and they're not going to discover everything. Remember, none of these options for building an asset register are perfect. So you're going to have to explore the combination of them that makes the most sense for you in your environment. So let's wrap up this section and let's take a step back because we've learned a lot over the last couple of modules, especially now focusing on how do we build out this asset register, which is a list of all the hardware and software and firmware we have in the environment. And then we add in all of this additional context, makes and models and vulnerabilities, and just think, yeah, what would an attacker do with that information? So attackers are looking for your asset registers because they can use it as a treasure map to show them exactly how to move through the environment really quickly. So we have to make sure that we protect the asset register accordingly. So some ideas around how we can secure it, right? So it's going to be stored, that Excel spreadsheet or that database. Usually it's going to be living on a Windows server, maybe a Linux box, usually a Windows server though. So use the Center for Internet Security standards and guidelines for locking down Windows and Linux systems, right? Go check out their website, download the appropriate guide and follow that to lock down the system to make it as secure as possible, right? We talk about encrypting, right? Make sure the Excel spreadsheet itself is encrypted. Now, it does get a little dicey in OT because then you assign a password to it. And then it becomes a question of, well, what if somebody forgets the password and they need to have access to the asset register for emergency from an operations perspective? Completely understand. So that's going to be a decision whether you put a password on it or not. And then usually if you do, it's probably a simple password, but I would say a little security is better than no security. We just have to make sure anything we do for security never interferes with operations, especially in an emergency type of situation. So access controls, right? Limit who can access it. If you have more of a database or online system, maybe you even purchased, or you have your asset registered stored in a platform like a Clarity, Nozomi, Dragos, you should be able to limit, right, what aspects, what parts of the asset register your users can actually access. So you might have some folks like in engineering that can access all of the information, and then you could have somebody, right, in maybe an operations role that can only access part of the information related to the part of the plant that they're responsible for. Right? Because we don't want people to have access to everything. And it's not that we don't trust them. It's, well, what happens if an attacker gets a hold of their account and it now assumes their permissions, right? We never want to, again, assume that we're not going to trust an employee, but we are going to assume, right, that an attacker is going to gain access to that employee's credentials. So make sure it's physically secure. Remember, in IT and OT, if I can touch a system, I can own it. So we want to make sure that attackers can't get to the system that is actually storing the asset register. And you probably think of a lot more controls to add as well. Things like adding endpoint protection, right? Even in OT, we see endpoint protection on Windows systems more and more these days. Right? What about network security monitoring and a lot of the other controls we're going to talk about as we go through a class? Right? A lot of these still apply, even if we're just talking about protecting the asset register that's sitting on maybe that Windows file server that's in the OT network. So the last thing to talk about is just a reminder, right? To make sure that the register stays updated over time. We should have processes in place. And you'll see this in the asset register template that we created. So remember, you need to have a process, whether it's once a week, once a month, once a year. Have a process you're doing on a regular basis to follow steps to go through to see if anything is missing from the asset register, to make sure that it's as up to date as possible. The best way to also make sure that the asset register stays up to date is tie it in with your change management procedures. So that way, when any change is made in the environment, like PLC goes on the fritz, PLC tech has to swap it out, right? That they know as part of that change management process, once the work is done, once they've completed it, they still have to do the paperwork before they're done. And part of that paperwork is making sure that the asset register is updated with, at least in that case, the new MAC address or any other properties of that asset have changed. Right? Then, of course, we also want to remove assets or at least mark them as decommissioned in the asset register. I would not completely delete them out, but just mark them as decommissioned. So that way, down the road, if you ever have a question about a particular MAC address that's no longer in use, you know exactly what it was related to. And finally, this is going to build into one of our next sections when we're talking about incident response. But what happens when we find a new asset on the network and it's not in the asset register? And we've actually had a pretty solid asset register now at this point for at least a year or two. Now this is something like we need to investigate, right? We need to kick off our incident response process, right? That investigation to determine, hey, what is this IP address? More than likely, right? It's not an attacker in the environment, but it could be somebody doing something that they shouldn't be. So we want to make sure we investigate as quickly as possible, right? Identify what it is and determine if it needs to be there or not. Because if it doesn't, it could result in a safety or availability issue.